Hello and welcome to lesson 2, the front and centre of this inquiry, and we begin at a tree in Morant Bay, southeast Jamaica. So this is in a region called St Thomas in the East, still a region in Jamaica today, and the year is 1865. Slavery in the British Empire has been legally outlawed for 32 years since the Emancipation Bill became an act in 1833. But we're going to find out why this moment is so significant for us and why this moment leads us to a very important question that we're going to be asking over the next few weeks. This section of the lesson we'll be taking notes and answering questions, so please do make sure you have paper ready, or even your note taker. So it's August 1865 and an anonymous placard is placed on a tree in Morant Bay, a tree looking very similar to the one you see here, and it reads, "Remember that," and this is an extract from the placard, "remember that he only is free whom the truth makes free. You are no longer slaves, but free men." So this is found on a tree in 1865. This leads to some questions. Why would such a message be written and posted on a tree? And why do you think it was posted anonymously? Now, again, there's lots of answers you could give to this question, but such a question reminding people that they are free implies that they need to be reminded, and potentially implies that their freedom is not so clear. Despite the fact that the message is clear, the intent of the message seems to be to push for a particular political change. Why posted anonymously? Now, again, lots of speculation you could have on this, but you may want to think that being named as the author of such a message may have been a dangerous thing. So we're getting a sense here that maybe this placard was put up for political purpose, and that potentially being found to be the person or persons to have put this placard up could have been deemed dangerous by the author. Question 3 I'd like you to think about, but we're going to park it there for the moment because it's the one that we're going to return to. The author clearly has a purpose in creating this placard, this message that's pinned to the tree. By the way, the tree being one of the central parts of the town. But why? What is that? Does it suggest here that the author believes there to have been a big change occurring that they wanted to note and maybe congratulate, or do they potentially seem to be wanting to push further change and potentially believe that there isn't or hasn't been enough change already? So what is going on? Well, that was August. This is October. In October 1865, an event occurs in a town called Morant Bay, which is there on our map, which for a lot of people, or for a lot of the British Empire, is quite a classic tale. It's a tale of unhappy local residents resisting British imperial rule. And if you watch this video, then historian David Olusoga will explain in good detail what happened at this particular courthouse pictured here in 1865. But the point that Olusoga makes is it's not necessarily what happens there that is so remarkable, so significant, and so important for us, but it's what happens next. What happens next, again, Olusoga explains here in the video that you should watch, is significant for us, because what happens next is a crucial moment in the history of the British Empire and a crucial moment in the history of Jamaica. Historian Clinton Hutton, who you see in the video, says this. He says that the slave-owning class in Jamaica was still in power after emancipation. So they weren't, or there wasn't that transformation that occurred or was demanded by the enslaved peoples after emancipation in 1833. That's the removal of slavery. The idea that black people should have been given the right to rule their own destiny was the furthest thing from their mind. So we're getting a sense here that this rebellion, this revolt, this war, was a war against British imperial rule, and particularly white rule, or slave-owning classes rule. And that slave-owning class were the white planter class, or the plantocracy as it's sometimes referred to. And on the left-hand side you can see an image here, sketch of the execution of some of the rebels, and you should notice that courthouse, because that courthouse looks very similar to the one, it is indeed the drawing of the one which Olusoga is placed outside of, or inside of. And this is what gets known as the Morant Bay War, which already has been hinted at by the historians that you've heard from, is a hugely significant moment in the history of both Britain and Jamaica. But that's actually the end of our study. Quite weird. Normally we'd start at the beginning, but no, we started at the end. The end of the Morant Bay War is around about 1865. But actually, we're going back 100 years. We're going back to 1760, because we need to understand how much has changed. That and those anonymous authors who wrote the placard demanding change, reminding people of change, that we need to understand the story. Where have they come from? What particular lives have they lived? What folk memories have they grown up with? What have they known of their past? And particularly, what has happened with Britain and Jamaica and its history in the 100 years previous to lead to this moment? Okay, and we begin with actually something of a similar event 100 years before. And this is a sketch of it. Again, similar kind of sketch. We see the sketch here of another brutal execution of rebel leaders. On the left hand side you can see them placed not being hung but in gibbets. And a gibbet, for those that don't know, it is a torturing device effectively to hang people up and kill them, but starve them to death publicly over a series of days. This is the execution of Fortune in Kingston, being sketched here by Cimetière, who is a visitor to the town of Kingston at the time. And the two leaders here of a revolt against the colonial rule and slave owners at the time are named Fortune and Kingston. So what was Tackys War or Tackys Revolt? There's been a lot of really interesting and amazing scholarship on this, particularly by an author and historian named Vincent Brown, but let's just get some of the facts down. In 1760, some 1,500 enslaved black men and women, perhaps fewer, but probably, if we're to believe Brown, more, took advantage of Britain's 7 years war against France. They were distracted in fighting France and Spain in both the Caribbean and actually all around the world. Their navy was distracted in parts of the East Indies as well. And it began on April the 7th, this revolt, in the Windward parish of St Mary's, and continued in the Leeward parish, the other side of the island, until October of the next year. So it took over a year of rebellion and revolt, and it took over a year for the colonial powers, the plantocracy, the white rulers, to enforce order, or reinforce order, should I say. Over the course of 18 months, the rebels killed as many as 60 whites and destroyed many thousands pounds worth of property. During this suppression over the revolt, over 500 black men and women were killed in battle, executed, or committed suicide in order to avoid execution or torture. Another 500 were transported from the island for life, usually to other islands, broken up, sometimes, in fact, quite commonly to North America, as has been recorded by other historians. And colonists at the time valued the total cost of the island to the island. Remember, Jamaica being such a source of great wealth for the British Empire at this time, probably the most valuable kind of set of land in all of the British Empire, not per capita, but per square mile. But the colonists, they valued the cost of the rebellion as being up to £250,000 at that time. Now, there are so many different ways of calculating this, but one way is to roughly times by 1,000 for this time. and we can get a rough estimate of what that cost would be, which would there bring us towards a £250 million cost of this rebellion in today's figures. So it was a huge cost to the production of sugar, particularly from that island. And as I mentioned, Vincent Brown, the work he's done on this in mapping the slave revolt, or mapping what is referred to and what he likes to call Tackys War, or Coromantee War as well. And more reading will help you understand why he calls it that. But he's mapped this in digital form as well on his website, and it is absolutely stunning. It's worth checking out. And he's really trying to understand what's going on in the head of the leaders and those that take part in the revolt. How was it dealt with, though? Okay, because we heard about how Morant Bay, a rebellion against, or an uprising against colonial rule, was dealt with. But how was it dealt with in 1760? Well, Richard Gott, historian of the British Empire, has given us a description here. Tackys' rebellion spread through the island and lasted for several months. It was crushed by superior force, but a guerrilla war continued for a year. Tacky was eventually captured by the Maroons and shot. His severed head was taken to Spanish Town, a major town at the time, in fact, the capital city, and stuck on a pole. His fellow rebels, Fortune and Kingston, were hung alive in irons on a gibbet in the centre of Kingston. Fortune lived for some 7 days, Kingston for 9. Some 400 rebels were shot. Others were burned to death over a slow fire. Many committed suicide. Long concluded that such exercise in frightfulness proved of doubtful value. This refers to the historian of Jamaica, Edward Long, historian of Jamaica, and also slave owner and brutal colonist of the island. So we might want to think here about why gibbets were used in particular. They were a less efficient way of killing your leaders, but certainly they, and this is the example here of a gibbet on the right hand side, were used a lot at the time by the British, both at home and abroad, in order to show and show off the execution and torture of their of those that chose to and led rebellions against them. So we have here a kind of performance of punishment, a performance of execution that lasted for several days, and we can think there that that may have been the purpose of the execution technique. So I want us to just row back a bit now. We've heard about 2 rebellions. We've heard about a Morant Bay War, and we've heard about Tackys War. Both cases we've seen sketches of these moments, sketches by observers in source 1 and in source 2, 2 different observers 100 years apart, or 95 years apart. 95? No, sorry, 105 years apart. So we need to start asking these questions. How much has really changed? And we've heard some suggestion of some arguments of how much really changed during this period. But this is really the crux of our inquiry, the crux of our coursework piece, the crux of what we're going to be asking again and again and again over weeks is really what had changed. Because in some ways, so much had. We look at that timeline below and we see events here, some significant events that changed the history, changed the experiences, changed the lives of those living on the islands of Jamaica and of Britain. And yet, when we look at the sources, when we go through the archive, when we ask the questions of the historians, they seem to suggest to us that actually not as much changed as we might first think. So today's title and the title of our overall inquiry was there more continuity than change in British-Jamaican relations between 1760 and 1870? Because as I've said, our anonymous authors who try to remind Jamaicans, and black Jamaicans in particular, that you are no longer slaves but free men, they're asking this question too, and I think it's doing justice to them to ask this question over 150 years later. We need to remember that these people were acting not just as historical actors but as reflecting and thinkers and revolutionaries who like to look into their past as well. So they were aware of their past as well, and they're asking this question, and I think it, as I say, does justice to them if we ask that question too, of how much really had changed. So between 1760 and 1838, we have this system that some refer to as colonial slavery, slavery within a colony on the island of Jamaica, as well as many other islands in the Caribbean that the British held, whereby enslaved persons from Africa, predominantly West Africa, were kidnapped and taken to work on plantations. Now, 1807, the slave trade is abolished by the British, or in the British Empire, and roughly soon afterwards, although some historians have brought to light that actually it took a while, but soon afterwards the slave trade ended, and so people were no longer kidnapped from West Africa. But slavery still existed until 1833, and actually, because of a system of what we call apprenticeship, or what was called apprenticeship, many have argued that actually effectively a system of enforced labour existed in Jamaica until 1838. But don't worry, we'll look at that in more detail. So until 1838, we had Afro-Caribbeans, black Jamaicans, who were ruled over, forced to work by almost universally white planter class, or plantocracy, as some historians refer to it as. And even after that, and even beyond our course, we have a system of colonial rule in which the British Empire, again, predominantly white, send over governors and rulers, predominantly white, to rule over this country. And independence is only achieved by Jamaica in 1962, and an interesting video on that can be found on the website from the Parfait video newsreel describing the moment of independence. So the extent and the nature of changes in British rule and British-Jamaican relations between Tackys revolt and the Morant Bay Rising, or Morant Bay War, has been the focus of intense debate by historians. And as I've said, this anonymous notice, these anonymous placard writers, who I'd like to think we're doing some justice to by returning to, are asking this question themselves. They are historical actors, they are reflecting their history and thinking about their history at the time. And so we're going to return to that question. And there's a question there that we've kind of already addressed around, do we think the authors believe that change had occurred? I think the authors probably would answer our inquiry question, the authors of this placard, in quite a clear way, and they would say that no, change really hadn't occurred to the extent that it needed to. Okay, but it's not that simple. Like I said, a lot happened and a lot needs to be understood, and undoubtedly a lot of change happens, and we can find some arguments and maybe even a consensus on what did change. So task B, and a really important task for you guys to do, is to go through your timeline and make sure you've got the title, or you read through and give a title to the key events. Now, a simple way to do this would just be to go online, find the website, and copy out the key word or the key title I've given it. But I think a better way of doing this is just reading through and giving a title to the events yourself. So make sure you read it properly. And please do make sure you thought about that event and just try to understand it. You don't need to remember it, that's fine, but do try and get an understanding of as many as possible. Because this brings us to the crux of the lesson and what is really going to set us up for later lessons. Because when we talk about the history of British-Jamaican relations, or Britain and Jamaica, that is a vast area of history. And within that could be so many different elements. In fact, basically, the complexity of that question would reflect the complexity of all people's lives over that 100-year period. And so as historians, we need to specialise. We need to decide what area we're going to fully delve deep into and provide some kind of more meaningful and crucially evidence supported or source supported arguments to make. And, you know, I've made a choice here of 5 areas that I think and I have identified as both meaningful, but also areas of historical debate, and areas where we can ask this question in interesting ways. And these areas are as follows. The first question, and the question that I think is at the front of our minds with this lesson in particular, is the question asked by those anonymous authors in Morant Bay. Did the lives and experiences of Black Jamaicans improve, change, alter after emancipation? And if so, by how much? But also, and we see this again with today's lesson, Morant Bay and Tackys revolt or Tackys war are both examples of resistance to a form of rule that we may want to refer to as plantocracy or white rule, or colonial rule. But what happened to this resistance over this 100-year period? Was there a kind of continuity of what some historians, I think famously W.E. Du Bois refers to slavery as a constant war. If it is a constant war, then is there this continuity of resistance? Does resistance change? Does it pop up at certain moments and does it subside at others? So what happened over this period to organised resistance? And when I say organised resistance, I don't mean the day-to-day resistance that is inevitable in a system of slavery, because no one wants to be enslaved. That is not a natural state of affairs. And so ultimately, it's a constructed one that is always resisted. But when we talk about organised resistance, we talk about more visible, open rebellion, revolt, uprisings, wars. So that's a question we'll be answering. Thirdly, race. We don't just have a system of slavery during this time. We have a system of race that is constructed, reconstructed, well, almost on a daily basis. This is a system that actually many have argued outlives slavery. And there's been huge historical debate on this. And this is actually an area of ongoing interest by historians. So we'll be asking the question, how were both the enslaved and the white population in Jamaica represented during this period of 100 years? Did the end of slavery mean the end of racism? I think it's quite clear that it didn't, but then what did it mean? And that's something we'll be asking. Fourthly, British public opinion. There is a very famous quote by a notable 19th century Victorian historian by the name of W.H.E. Lecky, who says that the British had engaged in an inglorious crusade. They were steadfast in their inglorious crusade against slavery. And certainly you see this reflected in modern day understandings of British Empire and British history, that yes, of course there were some crimes, but underneath it all, the British did abolish slavery. And so the British, you always were unhappy or uncomfortable with this state of affairs of slavery. And ultimately this crusade, led by the notable likes of William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, Granville Sharp, this notable crusade was, or inglorious crusade, was a kind of constant of British history during this period. Is that true? Do we see the triumph of an abolitionism in England and in Britain in the 18th and 19th century? And does that mean, therefore, that no dissonance, no difference, no alternative arguments are ever given, even towards the end and after emancipation? And by looking into that question, by bringing in historians like Catherine Hall, by bringing in historians like David Olusoga, but bringing in a lot of the scholarship on 19th century Victorian attitudes towards race, we see that the question is a bit more complex. It is not simply a kind of Whiggish history that Britain gets less supportive of slavery. There are certainly elements of that are not true. But to the extent that that is not true, we will argue, we will debate, and you will construct your own arguments using evidence. And finally, and this is actually one of the more established debates within the history of this particular period in this part of the world, but the profitability of the Jamaican economy is a huge historical debate. And this may seem quite dry and unimportant, but actually when we pull it apart, we see is a central debate around the nature of change and continuity during this period. This is identified sometimes by historians as the decline thesis, notably proposed by a man, a brilliant historian by the name of Eric Williams in the 20th century, who argues effectively the West Indian economy in places like Jamaica, like Trinidad, was in decline in the 18th century. And effectively slavery was not as profitable as it had been by the end of the 18th century. And therefore abolition was, according to people like Williams, partly due to the fact that it was no longer as profitable as it had been, that instead that there was a kind of that the financial motive behind abolition needs to be properly recognised. Now that's been actually disputed by other historians that we'll also be looking at, most notably Seymour Drescher, and there's been some back and forth around this, and it's led finally to a real reconciliation and an attempt to understand the continuity in wealth of the plantocracy of the West Indian merchants, both in Britain and in Jamaica, most famously this being in the case of the compensation records, which were millions of pounds, 20 million in money of the day, unprecedented amounts of compensation paid, not to the slaves, not to the enslaved peoples that had been emancipated, but to the slave owners for claiming that their property had been removed from them by the state. And the shame of this should be felt by many, or is felt by many, but certainly it's notable to say that the money that was paid out only recently has been finally, as a loan that was taken out by the government, has only recently been paid off. And we've got great records of which families were given what amounts of money, and in order to do that they claimed the amount of people that they enslaved, and therefore in their mind lost at the point of emancipation. So we've got these categories, and what I'd like you to do is first off, listen to this, understand that those are categories we're going to look at, areas of history, because ultimately, like I've said before, if we just took this whole period and said, all right, let's look at it all, then we might get a little bit lost. We want instead to construct some kind of structure for us to start exploring with. But these are 5 categories that I'd like you to use in your timeline, because you've now gone through, hopefully, your timeline. You've put in titles for the events, having read them. And I'd like you to just have a think. Well, I've read this event now. I've given it a title. What lesson, what area, what period, or sorry, what theme in history during this period would this particular event turn up in? Okay, I like to use this analogy when I talk about writing a coursework piece. A coursework piece is a bit like building a 3 or 4 story structure. You need to do it right. You need to make sure your foundations are correct, but you also need to decide how many rooms you're going to have. And at the moment I'm offering you 5 rooms. I'm saying that you need at least 3, but probably 5 rooms to start with to construct, and in each room is going to be a particular theme of this whole period, of this 100-year period. So one room might be on British public opinion, one room might be on attitudes and constructions of race. So now we're asking, having gone through and going through the timeline, we're asking, well, which events go in which room? Which events go in the room about race? Which events relate to rooms around the room on organised resistance? And of course, and this is of course a point to make again and again, there are many events that go in more than one room, because of course a revolt is not just about organised resistance, but it's also about potentially the conditions of the enslaved people who are living on the island at the time. So you've got one event going in more than one theme or more than one room, and I'll return to that analogy again, I'm sure. So that's task C. Finally, and this is, I know, a really, really round-the-stock tour of this period. You're not going to know every single event, but what I'd really like you to do is begin on picking apart this question. Now, it doesn't need to be perfect. I don't need to see anything more than a paragraph that attempts to summarize this period of change and continuity. So what changed and what stayed the same? Okay, I'd really like you to bookend it by talking about Tackys War and the Morant Bay War. So those both need to turn up at some point, but using the keywords that I've suggested potentially could be a useful tip for this, and it'd be a really nice way for you to start off this inquiry, because ultimately we will be returning again as I said to this question, and we will be asking how much has really changed. So using these keywords is going to really help you in doing that. Okay, I think that's all for now. I hope you give it your best shot. And like I said, there's no point rushing this lesson, because this lesson is the front piece. This is the frontispiece. This is the center. This is everything that will then come next. So do make sure you've got it down properly. And then for now, good luck.